Aloha, and today on PurEpoxy-Hawaii.com we're going to be grinding the floors, vacuuming the floors, and mixing up some epoxy to pour on the floors. Stay tuned for this and more. Today on PurEpoxy-Hawaii.com we're going to be turning these ugly bare concrete floors into all white epoxy floors. Look how beautiful it is. Look at that shine on the floor where he's sanding. He's going to move the door right there. Look at that reflection. Beautiful. We're going to be conducting our project in 3 parts. Part 1 is preparation, Part 2 is application, and Part 3 is finishing. For the preparation stage, you're going to need grinders, diamond grinding wheels, shop vac, mop and bucket, respirators, and earplugs. In the preparation stage, we begin with grinding. We use a grinder with a diamond grinding wheel to get all the top layer of cement off the floor. We need to do this so that the epoxy has something to adhere to stick to. Now you can see that the grinder is connected to a hose which is connected to a shop vac, a regular old shop vac. So again, the objective is to remove the cream layer of concrete that's on top, and you know that you've gotten down to the correct level when you start to see the aggregate, the rocks in the cement. The next step in preparation is to widen cracks that are already existing in the floor. He's using a hand grinder with a diamond wheel and a vacuum cleaner with an extension. As he goes along and grinds, the vacuum is sucking up most of the cement dust. He's also wearing earplugs, but he should also be wearing a respirator. After widening the cracks, the next step is to fill the cracks with sand. He just uses a cup, fills it with sand, and pours it directly into the cracks. We do this because our crack filler in our next step requires sand to give it something to adhere to as it dries and hardens. We mix our crack filler in 2 parts, part A and B, a 1-to-1 ratio. We usually mix 4 ounces of A and 4 ounces of B, giving us a total of 8 ounces at a time. You don't want to mix too much at a time because this product sets up really quickly within about 90 seconds. So you have to act quickly as you pour it into the cracks with the sand in it. So you just pour it directly over the sand into the cracks, and you use a trowel, just like almost like spreading out cement with the aggregate, the sand. You just spread it out and smooth it out as best you can. After letting the crack filler cure, which takes about 5 to 10 minutes, we use a diamond grinder again to flatten out the high areas on those cracks where we've gone over with the crack filler. So what we're doing is we're just flattening out that area. We find that every floor is different, and this floor in particular is pretty damaged. So what we did was, in certain areas, we put on a skim coat of concrete just to smooth out the area, because if you don't smooth out the entire floor, you're going to see all the pits and dents in the floor in the final product once we put on the final coat of epoxy. So we don't want to do that, so we want to put on a skim coat and cover up all holes and cracks. Since the skim coat is smooth once it dries, we have to grind that down and rough it up so that the epoxy has something to stick to. Even though we had grinders that had vacuums attached to them, there's still a lot of grinding dust and dirt and debris all over this floor, so we had to go ahead and vacuum everything before the next step. The last step in preparation is mopping up the final particles of dust that the vacuum cleaner didn't get. We're trying to do a dry mop. where it's not soaking wet, but where you can just pick up the dust. The next stage in our project is part 2, application. During the application stage, you're going to need PE 100 epoxy, super white pigment, 18 and 9-inch rollers, roller frames, chip brushes, 5-gallon buckets, mixing paddle, drill, and spike shoes. The first part of application is mixing the epoxy. We mix our epoxy 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts A to 1 part B. We add pigment, and we add 1 jar of pigment per part A. So there's 2 part A, so there's 2 per kit. Right here he's mixing the pigment into part A. 1 jar of pigment per part A. He's going to mix part A and a jar of pigment for about 1.5 minutes. Part B is already in the bucket. He starts mixing it, and the other guy starts dumping in the part A with the pigment into part B, and he's going to dump the other one in there also. We mix part A and part B for at least 1.5 minutes. After mixing the epoxy, it's time to roll out the epoxy all over the floor. Here they're starting to roll out the epoxy, and they notice that there's some contaminants that have fallen into the epoxy. So now's the time to get out and notice anything that's falling into the epoxy or it's on the floor and creating, well, there's debris on the floor. So even though we vacuumed multiple times and mopped, there's still things that could contaminate the floor. So be aware of that as you're rolling out the first layer. Here most of the room is already rolled out with epoxy. In order to even it out, we have to walk on it, be able to walk on it. In order to do so without picking up epoxy on your shoes, we use spike shoes. We generally use the 18-inch roller for the main floor, and right here you can see I'm using the 9-inch roller for the perimeter. After the first layer is cured, you can see that the floor looks great. What an improvement over that raw concrete floor that was all broken up. Look how shiny it is. There are a few low spots, and we always use a second layer to cover everything up. So that's the next step. After admiring that shiny floor for a few minutes, we hit it with the sander to scuff it up. Why do we do that? It's so that the second layer of epoxy has something to stick to. If you have a very damaged floor or very contaminated floor with oils and things like that, there will tend to be a lot of low spots. And what we're going to have to do is, after we've put on the first layer, is put on Bondo. And so he mixed up Bondo with the regular instructions, and we're just going over all the low spots all over the floor. Like I said, these low spots are most likely due to contaminants like oil or something like that where the epoxy wouldn't want to stick. Concrete shower pans. First thing we do is sand the concrete around the edges and all over the pan just to get the contaminants off. And then we vacuum up just like before. Vacuum all the debris and the dust. And then next we mix up some Bondo, and these showers had some chips in the edges, and so we had to fix those before we could continue. And then next is actually applying the epoxy to the shower pans. Now the shower pans obviously drain towards the drain, and so they slope downward. With epoxy you have to really have a level floor to roll it out, but if we do this, the shower pan with the slope on it, we have to do it in thin layers so that the epoxy doesn't just run off into the drain. Epoxy is very viscous, very liquidy, and so it likes to what we call gravity feed. If it's on a slope, it'll just slowly go down that slope. And so with the shower pan having a slope on it, we had to do it in layers. We did it about 3 or 4 layers. After sanding and vacuuming the first layer of epoxy, it's time to mop up the dust again with a damp mop, just going over it back and forth and rinsing it out every 5 to 6 feet. Mixing epoxy for layer 2. We did it all in one big batch. So again, the same thing, it's 2-to-1 ratio, 2 part A to 1 part B, and 1 jar of pigment to 1 part A. So you mix part A, B, and the pigment for at least 1 minute and 30 seconds. Pouring out layer 2. Layer 2 is usually the same as layer 1. Put it in a bucket, mix it, and pour it right onto the floor. This time we're using a squeegee. You don't have to, but we decided to use a squeegee, 9-inch roller, and an 18-inch roller. It's about all the same. Make sure you're rolling it out and overlap as you're going. Make sure there's no contaminants as you're going. Pick any particles out. And that's it. It's pretty much the same as layer 1. Part 3 is finishing. In part 3, you're going to need easy HD urethane, a paint tray, 18 and 9-inch rollers, roller frames, spike shoes, sanders, 220 grit sandpaper, shop vac, and mop and bucket. Sanding layer 2. Sanding layer 2 is the same as sanding layer 1, just using the sanders with a vacuum attachment to suck up all the dust, and you're just sanding to scuff up the floor so that the urethane layer, which is last, will adhere to it. Now it's time to mix urethane. It's a mixture of a ratio of 5-to-1, but they've made it easy for you. You have a 1-gallon canister, and then you have a small jar which you pour the entire thing into, so there's no guesswork. Just pour it right in, no guesswork. And then you start mixing it with the drill and the paddle. But we want a matte finish instead of a glossy finish. If you wanted a glossy finish, you would just stop right there and start and keep mixing. But we're going to add the sand particulates into this mixture so that it becomes a matte finish. It's actually this very fine sand. And just like with the epoxy, you mix it for at least 1.5 minutes. Rolling out urethane is similar to rolling out the epoxy, but instead of dumping the urethane on the floor, we put it in a paint pan or a paint tray. We also use the same 9-inch rollers and 18-inch rollers, brand new ones, and we also use spike shoes. So while he's trying to use the 18-inch roller and overlap and roll it out and smooth everything out, he has the spike shoes on so that he doesn't get his regular shoes sticky and dirt on the floor. And then the other guy is using a 9-inch roller along the perimeter of the entire wall. Ending notes. Just as a reminder, we started with this raw concrete floor with cracks, stains, pits, and all kinds of debris on it. And we ended up with this beautiful, white, glossy epoxy floor. Just look at it. It's beautiful. For all the products mentioned in this video, please go to PurEpoxy-Hawaii.com and buy all you want. Also, if you liked our videos, please subscribe and hit that bell to be notified of our next videos coming out. Thank you.